valley in a silence so heavy, it feels like a physical weight on the chest. Inside our ancestral home, the air always smells of pine needles, expensive floor wax, and the metallic tang of secrets that no one dares to voice. For 10 years, the centerpiece of our Christmas Eve dinner hasn't been the roasted ham or the vintage wine. It was the empty chair, positioned at the far end of the long mahogany table. The 13th chair was a monument to my sister, Elara, the official story. The one my parents polished until it shone like a trophy was that Elara was a rebellious spirit. They told the neighbors she had run away on a freezing December night a decade ago, chasing some fleeting dream in the city. But the townspeople knew better than to ask questions. In our family, the patriarch's word was law, and my father, Silas, was a man whose influence reached deeper into the soil of this valley than the roots of the oldest oaks. Every year, my mother would meticulously set Elara's place a silver fork, a crystal goblet, and a plate that remained tragically clean. It was a performance of grief designed to mask a much darker reality. I remember that night 10 years ago with a clarity that haunts my sleep. I remember the way the woods behind our house seemed to pulse with a rhythmic low thrum, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. Remember Elara's screams being cut short not by distance, but by something much more final. I remember the mud on my father's boots and the way my mother scrubbed the kitchen floor until her knuckles bled. We didn't talk about it. In the Blackwood family, silence was the only way to survive. We lived in a family miasma, a psychological fog where the lines between love and terror were blurred until they were indistinguishable. This year, however, the atmosphere was different. The house felt smaller, the hallways stretching and warping like the corridors of a dream. I found myself walking through the upstairs landing, staring at the wallpaper, realizing the patterns didn't quite line up anymore. It felt like the house was a skin that was becoming too tight for the entity living inside it. My parents were on edge. My father's hands, usually steady as stone, shook as he lit the fireplace. My mother kept glancing at the windows, her eyes searching the dark tree line as if she expected the shadows to detach themselves from the trunks and come knocking dot as the clock struck 6. The guests arrived, the inner circle of our rural community. The people who helped my father keep the valley pure. They were men and women with cold eyes and forced smiles. People who understood the price of prosperity. We took our seats, the familiar weight of the tradition settling over us. 12 of us sat down, leaving the 13th chair at the end of the table staring back at us like an open wound. Candle flames flickered violently, though there was no draft. Then the smell hit me. It wasn't the feast. It was the scent of damp earth, rotted leaves, and something sweet like lilies left too long in a vase. It was the smell of the deep woods, the places where the sun never reaches. My father began his annual toast, his voice booming with a false bravado, thanking the spirits of the valley for another year of harvest. But as he raised his glass, the front door, heavy oak and bolted tight, didn't just open, it vanished into a cloud of freezing mist. The temperature in the room plummeted instantly, our breath turning into ghostly plumes in the air. The lights didn't flicker. They turned a bruised, sickly purple. No one moved. No one breathed. From the darkness of the hallway, a rhythmic sound emerged. Thump, drag, thump, drag. It sounded like something heavy being pulled across the floorboards. Something that shouldn't be moving. I looked at my mother. She was white as a sheet, her fork clattering onto her porcelain plate with a sound like a gunshot. My father's face transitioned from confusion to a primal, bone-deep terror. Slowly, a figure stepped into the light of the dining room. It was tall, draped in a tattered white dress that was stained dark with peat and old blood. Long, matted hair hung over a face that was partially obscured by a veil of frost. The figure didn't scream. It didn't moan. It simply walked to the end of the table with a mechanical, jerky grace. The guests recoiled, some falling from their chairs, but my father stayed frozen, his eyes locked on the specter. The figure reached the 13th chair, pulled it back with a screech of wood on wood, and sat down. As she leaned forward into the candlelight, the frost on her skin began to melt, revealing the unmistakable features of Elara, but her eyes weren't eyes anymore. They were two bottomless pits of black water, reflecting the crimes of everyone in the room. She reached out a pale, trembling hand and picked up the silver fork. With a slow, deliberate motion, she began to scrape the empty porcelain plate, the screeching sound vibrating through our teeth. Then, for the first time in 10 years, she spoke. It wasn't a voice. It was a collective whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. A sound like 1,000 dead leaves skittering across a grave. I didn't run away. The voice hissed, vibrating in my very marrow. You just didn't bury me deep enough, as she spoke. The floorboards beneath the table began to bulge and crack. Dark, wet soil started oozing up through the gaps, smelling of the ancient, cursed earth of the Blackwood Grove. My father tried to stand, but he found his feet were rooted to the floor, the shadows from the corners of the room stretching out like oily tentacles to wrap around his ankles. Elara turned her head slowly, her neck cracking with a sound like breaking ice, and looked directly at the basement door, the one door we were never allowed to lock. The door creaked open an inch. A small, muddy hand reached out from the darkness of the cellar, holding a rusted shovel that I recognized instantly. The sight of that rusted shovel, clutched by a hand too small and too great to belong to the living, sent a wave of nausea through the room. It was the same shovel my father had carried into the Blackwood Grove 10 years ago, its blade chipped from striking the frozen schist of the valley floor. The basement door continued to groan, swinging wide to reveal not the familiar stairs of our home, but a descending void that seemed to lead into a subterranean forest. The air coming from the depths was thick with the smell of stagnant water and old, unwashed sins. Elara sat perfectly still in the 13th chair, her presence acting like a gravitational well, pulling the light and warmth from the dining room into her hollow frame. My father, Silas, was no longer the imposing patriarch of the valley. He looked small, his expensive wool suit hanging off a frame that seemed to be shrinking under the weight of her gaze. The shadows holding his ankles began to climb, wrapping around his knees like slick black vines. The guests, the same pillars of the community who had looked the other way a decade ago, were paralyzed. Their faces were masks of frozen horror, their polished shoes sinking into the rising tide of wet earth that now covered the expensive Persian rug. The psychological grip my parents had maintained for years was unraveling. This wasn't just a haunting. It was a physical invasion of our reality by the geography of our crimes. I watched as the wallpaper behind Elara began to peel away in long, wet strips, revealing not the wooden lath of the house, but ancient stone walls covered in strange, pulsating lichen. The house was transforming, shedding its domestic skin to reveal the back rooms of our family's history, a hidden, liminal space where the laws of nature were replaced by the laws of the blood debt. My mother made a sound, a thin, high-pitched murmur that was the only break in the oppressive silence. She reached for the crystal goblet at Elara's place, perhaps out of some reflexive need to tidy the table, but as her fingers brushed the glass, it shattered. The shards didn't fall. They hung in the air, spinning slowly, each facet reflecting a different memory from that night 10 years ago. In one shard, I saw the flickering torches of the rural cult my father led, the Order of the Deep Roots. In another, I saw the fear in Elara's eyes when she realized that her own family considered her a necessary sacrifice to ensure the valley's prosperity. The figure in the chair finally moved her hand away from the plate. She reached up and began to unpan the frozen veil from her hair. As the fabric fell away, it didn't hit the floor. It dissolved into a swarm of black moths that fluttered blindly around the room, their wings beating a frantic, rhythmic pulse against the windows. Her face was now fully visible. It was Elara, yet it was something much older. Her skin had the texture of wet parchment, and where her veins should have been, there were thin, translucent roots pulsing with a dark, rhythmic fluid. She didn't need words to communicate the depth of the betrayal. The house itself began to speak for her. Pipes in the walls groaned, a sound that shifted into the unmistakable cadence of Elara's voice. Echoing from every corner of the mansion, the sound told the story of the cold, the darkness, and the terrifying realization that the people who were supposed to love her, the ones holding the shovels, it spoke of the family miasma, the toxic atmosphere of gaslighting and control that had kept me silent for so long, making me an accomplice through my own cowardice. Suddenly, the dining table began to lengthen, the mahogany stretching until the guests at the far end were lost in a misty distance. The room was no longer a room. It was a clearing in a dark, interior forest that existed within the architecture of our home. The guests began to sink further into the mud, their expensive jewelry and watches being swallowed by the earth. as if the soil were reclaiming its payment. My father tried to scream, but when he opened his mouth, only dry gray ash spilled out. Elara stood up. The screech of the 13th chair was so loud it cracked the remaining windows. She walked toward my father, her movements no longer jerky but fluid and predatory. As she moved, the floor beneath her feet bloomed with white, sightless flowers that smelled of decay. She stopped inches from him, her black bull eyes searching his soul for a shred of remorse that wasn't there then. The small hand with the shovel emerged fully from the basement shadows, followed by the rest of its owner. It was a replica of me as I was 10 years ago, a small, terrified boy, but his eyes were stitched shut with silver wire. This spectral version of my younger self walked to my father and handed him the shovel. The message was clear. The work that began 10 years ago was not finished, and the earth was still hungry. My father's hands were forced onto the handle by an invisible pressure. Against his will, he began to dig into the floor of his own dining room. With every scoop of earth he tossed onto the table, a new secret was unearthed. From the hole, a collection of objects began to fly, a locket Elara had cherished, the blood-stained ribbon from her hair, and finally, a heavy iron key that I had never seen before. The key flew through the air and landed perfectly in front of me, vibrating with a cold, malevolent energy. Elara turned her gaze toward me, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flash of the sister I loved beneath the monster she had become. She pointed toward the attic, the one part of the house that was even more forbidden than the cellar. The walls of the dining room began to bleed a thick, resinous sap, sealing the doors and windows, trapping everyone inside with the digging patriarch and the vengeful dead. I realized then that the perfection of our family was being physically dismantled brick by brick, memory by memory. The only way out was up, into the heights of the house where the original lie was born. As I took the key, the floor beneath my father gave way completely, plunging him into a vertical shaft of darkness. His scream echoed up, not as a man's cry, but as the howling of the wind through the blackwood pines. The iron key felt like a shard of ice pressed against my palm, its weight far heavier than its size suggested. As my father plummeted into the abyss beneath the dining table, the rest of the room began to dissolve into a labyrinthine nightmare. The guests were gone, swallowed by the rising tide of peat and shadow, leaving only me, the specter of my sister and my mother, who sat paralyzed at the head of the table, her eyes wide and glassy. The family miasma had fully manifested now. The air was thick with a shimmering, oily haze that made the walls appear to breathe. I understood then that our house was no longer a physical structure in the Blackwood Valley. It had transitioned into a back room of the soul, a place where the internal architecture of our guild determined the physical space. Elara didn't follow me as I backed away from the table. She remained standing by the empty chair, her black bull eyes fixed on our mother. She didn't need to move. The house was acting as her extension. I turned and ran toward the grand staircase, but the steps had multiplied, stretching upward into an impossible spiraling heights that shouldn't have fit beneath the roof. Every landing I reached was a distorted mirror of a room I knew. In one, the nursery was filled with the sound of 1,000 ticking clocks, all out of sync, presenting the years stolen from my sister. In another, the library's books were bleeding ink that pooled on the floor to spell out the names of everyone who had watched Elara disappear and said nothing. This was the emotional horror of our legacy, a rural cult of silence that prioritized tradition over blood. The order of the deep roots wasn't just my father's hobby. It was the foundation of our wealth. They believed that for the valley to thrive, the earth had to be fed the brightest light of the leading family. 10 years ago, that light was Elara. As I climbed higher, the hidden messages in the house became impossible to ignore. Scratched into the wainscoting were the words we all watched, and beneath the peeling wallpaper of the third-floor hallway, unfound old photographs of the town council, their eyes all scratched out by a needle. The sense of isolation was absolute. Big backrooms feeling of the house intensified. The familiar floral patterns of the carpet turned into a sickening, repetitive maze that seemed to lead nowhere. I felt the presence of the woods following me up the stairs. The smell of pine and wet earth was replaced by the dry, suffocating scent of attic dust and old secrets. I realized that my father's fall wasn't the end of his punishment, but the beginning of his transformation into a permanent fixture of the house's foundation. He was becoming part of the very soil he had tried to appease. I finally reached the door to the attic, the apex of our family's shame. It was a small, unassuming wooden door, but the iron key in my hand began to glow with a dull, sickly light as I approached. This was where my mother spent her Sunday afternoons praying. But I knew now she was doing something far more sinister. She wasn't praying for Alara's soul. She was guarding the contract that kept the valley prosperous. The door didn't just have a lock. It was bound by chains made of human hair, braided tightly and smelling of salt and old grief. As I inserted the key, the house let out a low, vibrating hum that shook the floorboards. The hair chain snapped with the sound of breaking violin strings. The door swung open, revealing not a dusty storage room, but a meticulously kept shrine. In the center of the room sat a massive hand-carved loom, its threads made of the same dark hair that had bound the door. On the loom was a tapestry that was being woven by unseen hands, a living history of the Blackwood family. I saw the night in the woods depicted in horrifying detail, the torches, the ritual, and the moment my father realized the earth wanted more than just a sacrifice. It wanted a witness. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't just a bystander that night 10 years ago. My parents had made me drink from the cup of the roots to ensure I would never be able to speak the truth. The family miasma wasn't just around me. It was inside me, a supernatural gag that had kept my conscience suppressed for a decade. The key wasn't just to the door. It was to my own memory. I walked toward the loom and the tapestry shifted. It showed me standing at the 13th chair, but instead of Alara sitting there, it was me. The secrets weren't just hers. They were ours. Perfect family was a circle of monsters, and I was the final link. In the corner of the attic, I saw a series of jars, each containing a flickering, pale light. These were the voices of the town, the collective conscience of the valley, bottled up and hidden away so the cult could continue its work. Suddenly, the floor of the attic began to soften, turning into a thick, black moss. From the center of the loom, a figure began to emerge, woven from the hair and the shadows. It wasn't Alara this time. It was a composite entity, a terrifying fusion of all the children the Order had sacrificed over the generations. It had dozens of limbs and a chorus of whispering mouths, all reciting the same dark litany of betrayal. I backed away toward the attic window, hoping to see the lights of the town, but there was no town left. The house had completely detached from reality, floating in a void of gray mist and skeletal trees. The revenge wasn't just for Alara. It was a total reclamation of the Blackwood bloodline by the very forces they had tried to control. Below me, I heard the heavy, rhythmic footsteps of Alara climbing the stairs. She wasn't running. She was claiming each step. Behind her, I heard the sound of my mother's screams being suddenly silenced, replaced by the sound of something heavy being dragged upward. Alara wasn't coming for me to kill me. She was coming to show me what was behind the final curtain of the tapestry. The composite entity on the loom reached out a hand made of tangled threads and pointed to the very top of the tapestry, a section that was still being woven. I saw my own face appearing in the threads, but my eyes were being replaced by the same black pools as Alara's. Then, the attic door exploded inward. Lara stood there, her white dress now completely black, dripping with the sap of the family tree. In her hand, she held my mother's severed shadow, which was still writhing as if in pain. Alara didn't look at the monster on the loom. She looked at the window behind me. She raised a finger and pointed to the glass, where a message was being etched from the outside by invisible claws. The message read, "The roots demand the trunk died as the glass shattered." The freezing wind of the void rushed in, pulling me toward the edge. But it wasn't the fall that terrified me. It was the sight of my father, his body now twisted into the shape of a gnarled, leafless tree, growing out of the center of the dining room far below, his branches reaching up through the house to pull the attic and me down into his eternal, suffocating embrace. The collapse of the attic floor felt like the world itself was folding inward as I tumbled through the splintering wood and the swirling mist of the void. I didn't hit the ground. Instead, I was caught by the upward-reaching branches of the monstrosity that used to be my father. The tree, a grotesque fusion of human bone and blackened oak, had pierced through the center of our home, turning the grand mansion into a hollowed-out shell. I hung there, suspended in the rib-like branches, staring down into the remains of the dining room. The family miasma had reached its peak saturation. The air was no longer gas, but a thick, translucent ritual was reaching its final terrifying conclusion. My mother was no longer screaming. Had been integrated into the roots of the tree father, her face visible beneath the translucent bark, frozen in a silent, eternal wail. The guests of the town's elite had been reduced to pale, sightless grubs, burrowing into the mounds of wet earth that now replaced our floor. This was the true face of the rural cult. They hadn't been protecting the valley. They had been parasitically feeding off the land, and now the land was taking its pound of flesh. Laura stood at the base of the trunk, the undisputed conductor of this symphony of rot. She looked up at me, and for the first time, her black bull eyes held a flicker of something resembling pity. She began to climb the trunk, her fingers digging into the flesh bark with effortless strength. As she ascended, the house around us began to shed its remaining illusions. The walls dissolved into the back rooms of the Blackwood lineage in non-linear space. Every cruelty ever committed by our ancestors played out on a loop on the peeling wallpaper. I saw the original contract signed in blood 3 generations ago. I saw the many 13th chairs that had been filled and emptied long before Lara was born. The revenge was complete, but the hunger of the deep roots was not. The entity from the attic loomed the composite of the sacrifice descended from the shadows above, draping itself over the branches like a shroud of living hair. It whispered a truth that shattered the last of my sanity. The Blackwood family wasn't being punished by an outside force. We were the force. We were the fruit of a poison tree, and the only way to stop the cycle was for the tree to consume itself entirely. Alara reached me. She didn't strike me or push me. Instead, she placed her cold, damp hand over my heart. I felt the cup of the roots, the liquid silence I had been forced to drink, as a child began to boil in my veins. The supernatural gag was finally dissolving, but it was taking my life with it. My memories began to pour out of me, manifest as glowing embers that drifted through the dark room. I saw the shovel. I saw the mud. I saw the look on my father's face when he realized that Alara wasn't dead. When we threw the first handful of earth, she leaned in close, her breath smelling of the deep, ancient forest. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was the embodiment of the valley's vengeance. As the memories left me, the tree father began to groan, the wood splitting as it prepared to pull us all down into the subterranean dark. The iron key in my pocket grew white-hot, then melted, fused into my thigh. I was the lock, and she was the key. The house began to implode. The windows shattered inward, not from wind, but from the pressure of the secrets finally being aired. Outside, the Blackwood Grove was moving, the trees walking on their roots toward the house to reclaim the stolen timber of our home. The order of the deep roots was being erased from the map. The town would wake up on Christmas morning to find nothing but a massive, sinkhole-sized crater where the Blackwood estate once stood, filled with a black, churning water that no one would ever dare to fish died in the final moments. Alara pulled me into an embrace. It wasn't the hug of a sister, but the tightening of a noose. The ceiling of the attic, the loom, and the composite monster crashed down upon us. The floor gave way one last time, and we fell into the lightless deep, past the buried jars of voices, past the bones of the previous sacrifices, and into the heart of the valley itself. There was a sudden, violent silence. The cold was replaced by a crushing pressure, and the darkness became absolute. I felt my skin hardening, my fingers lengthening into roots, my blood slowing until it became the thick, resinous sap of the Blackwood line. I wasn't dying. I was being planted. The story of the perfect family ended there. No more Christmas dinners. No more empty chairs. Only the long, slow growth of the new woods over the ruins of the old world. The secret was no longer buried. It had become the soil itself, and somewhere, deep beneath the earth, 13 chairs sat in a circle in the dark, and for the first time in a century, every single one of them was occupied. The Blackwood name was gone, but the forest was finally, terrifyingly at peace.